The Viking Age, which traditionally begins with the infamous raid on the Lindisfarne Monastery in 793 AD, marks one of the most transformative periods in early medieval European history. This era saw small, seemingly isolated communities from the harsh and rugged landscapes of Scandinavia suddenly emerge as some of the most feared raiders, traders, and explorers in the known world. The rapid rise of Viking power during the late 8th and early 9th centuries was not a product of random chance. It was the result of a unique combination of environmental, social, economic, and technological factors that converged to propel these seafarers onto the European stage and, eventually, toward far-off lands such as the Islamic Mediterranean. Scandinavia, in the late 8th century, was a region defined by its dramatic geography and challenging climate. Norway's fjords, Sweden's dense forests, and Denmark's flat yet wind-swept plains created a society accustomed to hardship and survival. Agricultural land was limited, and farming communities often struggled to produce enough to sustain large populations. Harsh winters and short growing seasons made subsistence farming precarious, encouraging the development of a society where mobility, resilience, and the ability to seize opportunities were vital for survival. These conditions naturally fostered a culture where martial skill and resourcefulness were highly valued. Young men, in particular, were socialized into a warrior ethos, learning not only to fight but to navigate and survive in the challenging terrain and seas surrounding their homelands. It was in this environment that the Vikings developed their remarkable seafaring skills. The longship, perhaps the most iconic technological achievement of the era, was a product of centuries of experimentation with boat building in the northern waters. Lightweight yet durable, these ships could navigate the open ocean as well as shallow rivers, allowing Viking bands to strike swiftly at distant targets or retreat before larger forces could respond. The longship's design, shallow draft, symmetrical ends, and a combination of sails and oars enabled unprecedented mobility and strategic flexibility. Unlike other contemporary naval powers, the Vikings could conduct surprise attacks far inland along rivers or coastlines, bypassing fortified cities and defenses that relied on slower, heavier vessels. The social and political structures of early Viking society also contributed to the rise of their influence. Scandinavian communities were organized into small, clan-based units, often led by chieftains who gained authority through personal reputation, wealth, and military skill rather than centralized state structures. This decentralized model allowed for rapid mobilization of men for raiding expeditions without the constraints of bureaucratic oversight. Loyalty was built on personal bonds, honor, and the promise of wealth and prestige. Successful raiders could gain considerable social standing, sometimes rivaling or surpassing hereditary nobles. In many ways, the allure of raiding provided both economic opportunity and a socially sanctioned outlet for ambition, particularly for younger sons who would inherit little from family estates. Economic motivations were a significant driver of the Viking surge. While Scandinavian communities had local trade networks, particularly in amber, furs, and iron, the riches of Western Europe were far more tempting. Monasteries, towns, and wealthy coastal settlements in the British Isles, Francia, and beyond were easy targets for raiders equipped with superior mobility and surprise tactics. The earliest recorded Viking raid, on the Lindisfarne Monastery in Northumbria in 793, shocked contemporary Europe. Not only did it demonstrate the Vikings' capacity for sudden, violent attacks, but it also revealed the vulnerability of even sacred and fortified sites to these new maritime predators. This raid marked the beginning of a pattern: sudden, fast, and brutal strikes aimed at acquiring wealth, slaves, and prestige, rather than territorial conquest, though the latter would follow in later decades. The psychological impact of the Viking raids was immense. European chroniclers of the time described these warriors in almost apocalyptic terms, portraying them as men from the north with no regard for God or man, arriving like a storm from the sea. This perception was fueled by the Vikings' distinct appearance, blonde, often tattooed or adorned with jewelry, and their ferocious battle tactics. Raids often combined careful planning with ruthless execution. Settlements were ambushed at dawn, defenders overwhelmed, and loot swiftly carried away. The combination of speed, surprise, and savagery allowed Viking groups, sometimes numbering only a few dozen, to terrorize communities far larger than themselves. This fear itself became a strategic advantage, deterring resistance and encouraging tribute or surrender. Viking expansion was not limited to raiding. Trade played a critical complementary role in their rise. While Western European monasteries and towns were raided for wealth, the Vikings also established extensive trade networks connecting Scandinavia with the British Isles, the Frankish Empire, the Baltic, and even as far as the Middle East. Silver from Islamic lands, silk from Byzantium, and spices from the East flowed along these routes, often carried by the same ships that had earlier struck fear into coastal settlements. Trade allowed Viking communities not only to enrich themselves materially, but also to acquire foreign knowledge, technology, and ideas that further enhanced their capacity for both raiding and settlement. By the mid-9th century, the Viking presence had begun to shape the political landscape of Europe. In Britain, the establishment of the Danelaw, a territory controlled by Danish settlers, illustrates how raiding evolved into settlement and governance. In Francia, Viking incursions prompted fortification strategies, military reforms, and eventually treaties that incorporated Vikings into local political frameworks. The rise of the Viking Age thus reflects a dynamic process in which small Scandinavian communities leveraged mobility, martial skill, and economic opportunism to exert influence far beyond their homelands. In conclusion, the rise of the Viking Age was neither sudden nor accidental. It was the result of centuries of social adaptation to harsh environments, technological innovation in seafaring, economic ambition, and the cultivation of a warrior culture that valued skill, honor, and daring. The period between 793 and 850 AD laid the groundwork for the Vikings' most audacious ventures, including their journeys into the Mediterranean. By mastering their environment, both at home and at sea, and by exploiting the vulnerabilities of contemporary European societies, the Vikings transformed from isolated northern tribes into a force capable of reshaping the political and cultural landscapes of the medieval world. Their rise set the stage for the dramatic encounters and daring raids that would eventually take them to the rich and distant shores of the Islamic Mediterranean in 859 AD, linking Scandinavia to the broader currents of medieval history in ways previously unimaginable. By the early 9th century. The Scandinavian world was a tapestry of rugged landscapes, resilient communities, and a society deeply intertwined with the sea. While the broader European narrative often focuses on Viking raids and conquests, the underlying maritime culture and social structures of Scandinavia were critical in shaping the Vikings into the formidable raiders, traders, and explorers that history remembers. To understand the far-reaching expeditions, including those that eventually led to the Islamic Mediterranean, it is essential to appreciate the environment, technologies, and cultural values that made Scandinavia a cradle of seafaring innovation. The physical geography of Scandinavia profoundly influenced its people. Norway's fjords, Sweden's lakes and rivers, and Denmark's flat yet windswept coasts created a natural environment dominated by weight. Always. Travel overland was often slow and difficult due to dense forests, mountains, and marshlands. For communities seeking trade, sustenance, or even expansion, the sea was not merely a highway, it was a lifeline. Coastal communities became adept at boat building and navigation, skills that were taught and refined across generations. From childhood, Scandinavians learned to read the patterns of the wind, the behavior of tides, and the subtle signs of coastal geography, all essential knowledge for long journeys in small, open vessels. Central to this maritime culture was the longship, a technological marvel that embodied Scandinavian ingenuity. These ships were constructed using overlapping wooden planks, a method known as clinker building, which provided both flexibility and durability in turbulent waters. The longship's shallow draft allowed it to navigate not only open seas but also rivers and estuaries, enabling raiders to penetrate deep inland with little warning. Equipped with both sails and oars, these vessels could maintain speed regardless of wind conditions, offering unprecedented mobility. The craftsmanship required to build such ships demanded specialized knowledge and communal effort, reflecting a society where cooperative labor and skill transmission were highly valued. Longships were not merely tools, they were symbols of status and capability, with the finest vessels often commissioned by wealthy chieftains or successful raiders. Scandinavian society itself was uniquely suited to the cultivation of maritime prowess. It was organized into small, semi-autonomous communities led by chieftains whose authority depended on personal prestige, wealth, and martial skill rather than centralized bureaucracy. Social cohesion was maintained through a complex system of kinship, reciprocal obligations, and communal rituals. Young men were trained in combat, seafaring, and survival skills from an early age, often accompanying elders on hunting or trading expeditions. These experiences instilled not only practical skills, but also values of courage, loyalty, and resilience, qualities that were essential for the high-risk ventures of long-distance raiding. In essence, the society itself was a breeding ground for individuals who could thrive in dangerous and unpredictable maritime environments. Trade and exchange were integral components of Scandinavian maritime culture. While raiding is often emphasized in historical accounts, Scandinavians were equally adept at commerce and negotiation. Coastal settlements functioned as hubs for the exchange of furs, amber, iron, and other resources, connecting remote Scandinavian communities to broader European and even Eurasian networks. Archaeological evidence, including silver hoards and imported goods, reveals a sophisticated understanding of markets and value. Trade expeditions required not only navigational expertise, but also cultural knowledge, as merchants had to interact with a variety of peoples from Anglo-Saxons to Byzantines, negotiating prices and establishing trust. This dual identity, as both warrior and trader, made the Vikings versatile actors on the international stage. Religion and belief systems also reinforced the maritime orientation of Scandinavian society. Norse mythology and cosmology placed significant emphasis on the sea, weather, and natural forces, shaping both worldviews and practical behaviors. Deities such as Njord, associated with the sea and seafaring, and Odin, the god of wisdom, war, and travel, were central figures in communal rituals and personal devotion. These spiritual frameworks provided psychological support for ventures into the unknown, framing risk-taking as both necessary and honorable. Courageous voyages were not only a means of material gain, but also a demonstration of spiritual and personal valor, enhancing an individual's reputation and securing a lasting place in communal memory. The transmission of knowledge and culture was also maritime in character. Oral traditions, sagas, and poetry frequently celebrated seafaring feats, codifying navigational techniques, heroic exploits, and moral lessons. These stories, passed from one generation to the next, reinforced societal ideals and provided practical guidance for those preparing to embark on long voyages. In this way, maritime expertise was both a technical skill and a cultural inheritance, inseparable from the identity of Scandinavian communities. Children learned the lay of rivers and coasts alongside tales of legendary explorers, embedding in them an understanding of geography, weather, and strategy that would prove invaluable during real expeditions. Social hierarchy and wealth were closely tied to maritime activity. Chieftains who could command fleets of longships gained prestige, authority, and loyalty. Successful raiders and traders often accumulated wealth not only in silver and goods, but also in land, followers, and alliances. Maritime capability was therefore a measure of both personal and communal power. Communities invested in shipyards, docks, and storage facilities, ensuring that they could mobilize resources quickly for defense, trade, or raid. In essence, the sea was a vector for both survival and social advancement. It is also important to note the adaptability and innovation that characterize Scandinavian maritime culture. The Vikings were quick to adopt foreign technologies, navigational techniques, and cultural practices encountered during trade or conquest. They incorporated advanced shipbuilding methods from the British Isles and continental Europe, adopted foreign coins for commerce, and learned from local political structures to negotiate alliances or tribute. This adaptability enhanced their effectiveness and longevity as a maritime power, enabling them to extend their influence far beyond Scandinavia. Finally, Scandinavia's maritime culture was not isolated. It existed within a broader Northern European and Atlantic context. Contact with the British Isles, the Frankish Empire, and the Baltic regions provided a continuous feedback loop of technological, tactical, and economic innovation. Each raid, trade mission, or exploratory voyage contributed to a cumulative expertise, making the Vikings increasingly capable of undertaking long-distance expeditions to previously unreachable regions, including the Mediterranean. By the mid-9th century, these cultural, technological, and social foundations had matured to the point where ambitious Viking leaders could envision and successfully execute raids across vast distances, including the wealthy Islamic cities of southern Europe. In conclusion, the maritime culture and society of Scandinavia during the early Viking Age was a complex interplay of geography, technology, social structure, and belief. The sea was not merely a means of travel, but a defining element of identity, economy, and power. Longships, communal knowledge, trade networks, and a warrior ethos coalesced to produce a society uniquely equipped for raiding, exploration, and commerce on an unprecedented scale. This combination of factors ensured that the Vikings were not only capable of terrorizing local European settlements, but also prepared to project their influence into distant and sophisticated regions such as the Islamic Mediterranean. Understanding this culture is essential to appreciating how small communities from the northern fringes of Europe could become one of the most dynamic and eared maritime powers of the early medieval world. By the mid-9th century, the Mediterranean was a dynamic, interconnected world under the influence of Islamic civilization. From the bustling markets of Al-Andalus in the west to the thriving ports of the Abbasid Caliphate in the east, this region was a center of commerce, culture, and political power. It was an environment rich in resources, wealth, and opportunity, yet also a landscape of political fragmentation and vulnerability, which made it an attractive target for ambitious raiders, including the seafaring Vikings. To understand why the Mediterranean drew the attention of northern raiders, it is necessary to explore the political, economic, and cultural dimensions of the Islamic world during this period. At the heart of the Islamic Mediterranean were powerful states with diverse populations, sophisticated trade networks, and urban centers brimming with wealth. In the west, the Umayyad Emirate of Cordoba controlled much of the Iberian Peninsula, blending Arab, Berber, and Iberian cultures. Cordoba itself had become one of the largest and most prosperous cities in Europe, famous for its libraries, artisans, and marketplaces. Further south and east, the Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad, presided over a vast empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to North Africa. Although its western territories were often semi-autonomous or under local governors, the Abbasid realm facilitated trade and cultural exchange across the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean. Sicily, meanwhile, was a patchwork of Arab emirates, with wealthy coastal towns such as Palermo and Syracuse serving as commercial hubs and points of contact between Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. The economic vitality of the Mediterranean made it a tempting target for raiders. Cities and towns were centers of craftsmanship, agriculture, and trade, accumulating wealth in the form of coins, silver, spices, textiles, and other luxury goods. Maritime trade routes connected distant regions, allowing goods from Africa, the Middle East, and Asia to flow into Mediterranean ports. This economic density meant that raiders, though often few in number, could reap substantial rewards through targeted attacks. Coastal settlements, even those under the control of powerful Islamic rulers, were not always heavily fortified, especially in peripheral regions, making them vulnerable to sudden seaborne incursions. Monasteries, warehouses, and ports, rich in movable wealth, presented particularly tempting prizes. Politically, the Islamic Mediterranean was both strong and fragmented. While powerful empires existed, local rulers often maintained autonomy over their territories, sometimes resulting in inconsistent defense and governance. The Abbasid Caliphate, though influential, had begun to experience internal decentralization by the mid-9th century. Regional governors, military commanders, and merchant elites often exercised de facto independence, leaving some coastal regions less able to repel sudden raids. Similarly, in Al-Andalus, while Cordoba projected central authority, smaller towns and ports along the Atlantic and Mediterranean coasts were more exposed. This combination of wealth and uneven political control created opportunities for raiders capable of navigating the Mediterranean waters efficiently and striking with speed. Cultural and technological sophistication further distinguished the Islamic Mediterranean. Cities featured advanced architecture, fortified walls, and organized administrative systems. Urban populations were multilingual and cosmopolitan, facilitating trade and cultural exchange. Artisans produced high-quality textiles, metalwork, and ceramics, while scholars advanced mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and navigation. The Mediterranean's maritime knowledge, including the use of lateen sails, compass techniques, and star charts, enabled long-distance trade and communication. Ironically, these same innovations would also provide useful lessons to northern raiders who could adopt or adapt some techniques to enhance their own maritime capabilities. Despite these advantages, the Mediterranean coastlines were not immune to attack. Historical records show that raids, though less frequent than in northern Europe, were a persistent threat. Pirates, rival factions, and opportunistic raiders often tested coastal defenses. By the 9th century, news of raiding parties from distant lands, including Viking groups from the north, began to circulate. The northern raiders were unique in their combination of mobility, surprise tactics, and adaptability. Unlike local pirates, who often relied on smaller, less seaworthy vessels, the Vikings could traverse the Atlantic, navigate rivers, and strike deep into coastal towns before defenders could mount an effective response. The wealth of the Mediterranean, combined with accessible but sometimes poorly defended ports, made it a logical target for such expeditions. Religion played a significant role in shaping both the Islamic Mediterranean and the context for Viking encounters. Islam was deeply integrated into governance, law, and social organization. Mosques served not only as centers of worship, but also as places of learning, administration, and community coordination. Religious authorities could mobilize local populations for defense, but the same networks often focused on internal administration rather than external threats, leaving peripheral coastal settlements more exposed. Meanwhile, the cultural differences between Muslim populations and northern raiders reinforced the perception of Vikings as alien and terrifying invaders. Chronicles written in Arabic and later in European sources describe the Vikings as fearsome men from the north, emphasizing their suddenness, violence, and unfamiliar appearance. Trade networks were central to the vitality of the Islamic Mediterranean and were both a boon and a vulnerability. The Mediterranean served as a conduit between Europe, Africa, and Asia. Goods such as silver from Central Asia, spices from India, textiles from the Near East, and gold from Africa moved along these routes, concentrating wealth in ports and urban markets. While these networks made the region prosperous, they also made it attractive to raiders who could seize high-value cargoes quickly. The Vikings, skilled in long-distance navigation and with ships capable of river and coastal travel, were ideally positioned to exploit these opportunities. Their incursions into the Iberian Peninsula in the 8500s and 8600 demonstrate their ability to identify and strike lucrative points along these trade networks. Finally, the Islamic Mediterranean in the 9th century was a space of cultural exchange and hybridization. Ports such as Almeria, Palermo, and Tangier were not only economic hubs, but also places where languages, ideas, and technologies mingled. This cosmopolitanism meant that raiders could encounter not just wealth, but also sophisticated military and logistical challenges. The Viking expeditions into the region were therefore not simply attacks on isolated settlements, they were encounters with a civilization that combined wealth, strategy, and organization in ways that demanded adaptability, intelligence, and audacity from the raiders. In conclusion, the Islamic Mediterranean of the 9th century was a region of immense wealth, cultural sophistication, and strategic opportunity. Its coastal cities and trading hubs were rich targets for raiders like the Vikings, whose maritime skills and adaptability allowed them to exploit both the economic wealth and the political vulnerabilities of the region. While Islamic rulers maintained significant power, the decentralized nature of some territories, combined with the vast network of trade and the challenges of coastal defense, made the Mediterranean a tempting and achievable goal for northern seafarers. Understanding the economic, political, and cultural landscape of the Islamic Mediterranean is crucial for comprehending why ambitious Viking expeditions, culminating in the raids of 859 AD, were both possible and highly impactful. It was this complex and wealthy environment that the Vikings would encounter, navigating unfamiliar waters to strike at the heart of one of the most prosperous civilizations of the medieval world. By the mid-9th century, the Vikings had already begun to extend their reach far beyond the familiar coasts of Scandinavia, the British Isles, and the Frankish Empire. Long before the famous raid on the Mediterranean in 859 AD, northern seafarers had established indirect and direct contacts with the Islamic world through trade, diplomacy, and minor incursions along the Iberian Peninsula, North Africa, and the rivers of Eastern Europe. These early interactions reveal a pattern of curiosity, opportunism, and adaptation that would shape the Vikings' eventual penetration into the Islamic Mediterranean. Understanding these contacts helps illuminate both the capabilities of the Vikings and the vulnerabilities of Islamic coastal and riverine settlements at the time. Trade was the most significant form of early contact between Scandinavia and the Islamic world. Archaeological evidence from northern Europe shows an extensive flow of Islamic silver coins, known as dirhams, into Scandinavia during the 9th century. Thousands of these coins have been discovered in hoards across modern-day Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, indicating sustained trade and exchange. These dirhams were highly valued not only for their silver content, but also as a means of acquiring prestige and wealth. Unlike simple plunder, this trade required careful navigation, knowledge of distant regions, and connections with intermediaries who could transport goods from the Islamic world to northern markets. The presence of these coins reflects the Vikings' participation in a vast economic network linking the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and northern Europe. The Vikings also engaged in mercenary activity and diplomatic contact, which brought them into indirect association with Islamic powers. In Eastern Europe, for example, Vikings, known as Varangians, traveled along rivers like the Dnieper and Volga, establishing trade settlements and sometimes serving as soldiers or bodyguards for rulers who interacted with Muslim merchants or territories. While much of this interaction occurred hundreds of miles from the Mediterranean, it familiarized the Vikings with Islamic goods, coinage, and culture. Tales of exotic spices, silks, and precious metals filtered back to Scandinavia, stimulating interest in more ambitious voyages. The combination of trade and military service provided both the means and the knowledge to plan raids further afield. The Iberian Peninsula represented the Vikings' first direct encounters with Islamic political entities in the West. By the early 9th century, the Emirate of Córdoba had consolidated control over much of Al-Andalus, creating a prosperous society with urban centers, fortified towns, and bustling ports. Viking raids along the Iberian coast, sometimes launched from the Atlantic, sometimes from river mouths, demonstrate both the reach of Scandinavian seafarers and their adaptability to new environments. While many early raids were small-scale, targeting towns, monasteries and ports, they reveal a pattern of reconnaissance, opportunism and risk-taking. These incursions exposed Vikings to a more sophisticated style of urban defense than they had encountered in northern Europe, including fortified walls, local militias and early warning systems, necessitating new tactical approaches. Maritime routes facilitated these early contacts. The Vikings' longships allowed them to traverse both the open Atlantic and shallow river estuaries, providing access to a wide variety of coastal targets. Along the western Mediterranean, they began to recognize the strategic value of islands, estuaries, and river mouths as staging grounds for raiding and trade. Ports in southern France, the Balearic Islands, and the Iberian Atlantic coast provided entry points into territories under Islamic rule. These preliminary voyages allowed the Vikings to gather intelligence, understand regional politics, and develop strategies for navigating unfamiliar waters. Even when raids were unsuccessful or repelled, the knowledge gained informed future expeditions, including the more famous 859 AD incursion. Cultural exchange accompanied these early contacts. The Vikings were curious and observant, often acquiring foreign knowledge and technologies from the societies they encountered. Islamic metalwork, textiles, glass and coins were transported back to Scandinavia, influencing local craftsmanship and economic practices. The presence of Arabic inscriptions on Scandinavian artifacts demonstrates a level of engagement beyond mere trade or plunder, reflecting both aesthetic appreciation and practical use. Similarly, linguistic traces, particularly terms related to trade, currency, and navigation, entered Norse vocabulary through these interactions. These exchanges indicate that early Viking encounters with the Islamic world were not purely violent. They involved learning, adaptation, and selective incorporation of foreign techniques and knowledge. Religious contrast also defined early interactions. The Vikings, who adhered to their polytheistic Norse beliefs, encountered Islamic societies structured around a centralized religious and legal framework. While initial contacts were primarily economic and opportunistic, these differences heightened the perceived exoticism and potential threat of northern raiders in contemporary Islamic chronicles. Arab historians and geographers noted the sudden appearance of men from the north, whose appearance, tactics, and customs were unfamiliar and intimidating. This early documentation provides valuable insight into how both Vikings and Islamic societies perceived one another prior to the larger raids of the late 9th century. The political impact of early contacts was multifaceted. In some cases, the Vikings exploited local disputes within Islamic territories, forming temporary alliances or negotiating safe passage in exchange for tribute. These interactions required diplomatic acumen and a keen understanding of local power dynamics. They also demonstrate that the Vikings were not only raiders but shrewd opportunists capable of navigating complex political landscapes. Even limited raids or trade missions could yield significant returns, enhancing both the wealth and the prestige of Scandinavian leaders. This combination of martial skill, navigational expertise, and diplomatic intelligence laid the foundation for larger, more audacious ventures into the Mediterranean. Finally, the early Viking contacts with the Islamic world reveal a process of experimentation and learning that would culminate in the 859 AD. Raid. Initial trade missions taught northern seafarers the value of coastal cities and riverine access. Minor raids tested defensive capabilities and provided practical experience in navigating unfamiliar waters and engaging with foreign populations. Observations of local commerce, urban organization, and fortification informed Viking strategies, blending northern audacity with learned prudence. By the time the Vikings prepared their major Mediterranean expeditions, they possessed both the technical skill and the cultural knowledge necessary to operate far from home. targeting the wealthiest and most strategically significant locations. In conclusion, early Viking contacts with the Islamic world were a combination of trade, diplomacy, reconnaissance, and minor raids that provided the experience and intelligence necessary for more ambitious incursions. Through the flow of coins, textiles, and luxury goods, the Vikings gained not only material wealth, but also knowledge of distant lands and cultures. Maritime skill, tactical flexibility, and cultural adaptability allowed Scandinavian communities to move beyond Northern Europe, gradually pushing into territories under Islamic rule. These early encounters set the stage for the Viking raids of 859 AD, demonstrating that the expansion into the Mediterranean was not sudden or accidental, but the product of decades of preparation, exploration, and incremental engagement with the rich and complex Islamic world by the mid-9th century T. He Vikings had already established themselves as formidable raiders and traders in northern and western Europe. Their expeditions into the British Isles, Francia, and the rivers of Eastern Europe showcased a combination of skill, ambition, and audacity that set them apart from other contemporary societies. Yet, the leap from raiding European shores to venturing deep into the Mediterranean was not simply a matter of bravado or curiosity. It was driven by a complex web of motivations, economic, social, political, and environmental, that compelled Scandinavian communities to extend their reach far beyond their homelands. Understanding these motivations provides insight into why northern warriors would undertake journeys of hundreds, even thousands of miles, to confront distant, wealthy civilizations, such as those of the Islamic Mediterranean. Economic incentives, wealth, and resources. Economic opportunity was arguably the most immediate and tangible motivation behind Viking expeditions. While Scandinavia had local trade networks and produced commodities such as furs, timber, iron, and amber, the riches of southern Europe and the Mediterranean offered far greater potential rewards. Coastal cities, fortified towns, and urban centers in Al-Andalus, Sicily, and North Africa held treasures accumulated through commerce, agriculture, and taxation. Luxury goods, such as silver, gold, spices, silks, and finely crafted textiles, were abundant in these regions. Viking raids could be highly lucrative. A single successful assault on a poorly defended port could yield wealth equivalent to years of income from Scandinavian farms or trade ventures. Trade, rather than plunder, also motivated long-distance travel. Even when raiding was the primary objective, Vikings were astute observers of markets and exchange networks. They often established contacts with local merchants or intermediaries to facilitate the flow of goods back to northern Europe. By engaging in both raiding and trading, they could maximize the economic return of an expedition. The accumulation of wealth served not only practical needs, buying food, weapons, and ships, but also symbolic purposes, enhancing the status of chieftains and warriors within Scandinavian society. Social and cultural motivations, honor, prestige, and reputation. In addition to economic incentives, social and cultural factors played a central role in driving Vikings to distant lands. Scandinavian society placed a high value on personal honor, courage, and reputation. Successful raiding and seafaring were among the most direct ways to gain prestige and elevate one's standing within the community. Young men, particularly those without large inheritances or land, were often drawn to raiding as a means of social advancement. Wealth acquired through long-distance expeditions could translate into political influence, marriage alliances, and elevated social status. Moreover, the Viking worldview glorified exploration, risk-taking, and boldness in the face of danger. Sagas and oral traditions celebrated seafaring heroes who ventured into unknown waters and returned with wealth and tales of distant lands. The act of navigating vast oceans or penetrating the sophisticated civilizations of the Mediterranean was itself a demonstration of skill and valor, enhancing an individual's legacy within their community. Prestige and renown were thus inseparable from the decision to raid far from home, and long-distance expeditions allowed the Vikings to achieve a form of fame unavailable in more localized conflicts. Political motivations, competition and consolidation. Political factors within Scandinavia also contributed to outward expansion. The region was divided into small, semi-autonomous communities led by chieftains and local rulers, whose power depended on wealth, followers, and martial prowess rather than centralized authority. Competition among rival leaders could be fierce, particularly in areas where resources were scarce or succession disputes threatened stability. Raiding offered a way to consolidate power. A successful expedition could increase a leader's wealth, attract followers, and intimidate rivals. Additionally, internal conflicts sometimes made expansion an attractive outlet for ambitious warriors. Younger sons, disenfranchised nobles, or dissatisfied retainers faced limited opportunities at home and saw raiding abroad as a means of improving their circumstances. By participating in raids on distant lands, they could gain wealth and experience without directly challenging the authority of local chieftains at home. In this sense, overseas expeditions functioned as a safety valve, channeling ambition and aggression into ventures that could strengthen rather than destabilize the home society. Environmental and demographic pressures. Environmental and demographic factors further fueled Viking expansion. Scandinavia's harsh climate, limited arable land, and growing population created pressures that sometimes made overseas travel a necessity rather than a choice. Small farms could support only a finite number of families, and in periods of population growth, competition for land and resources intensified. Younger sons, in particular, faced the challenge of securing livelihoods without inheriting property. Raiding and settlement abroad offered a solution. The sea provided access to regions with abundant resources, fertile land, and wealthy cities, allowing ambitious individuals to carve out new opportunities far from home. Moreover, Scandinavia's geographic location naturally encouraged maritime exploration. The North Sea, the Baltic, and the Atlantic coasts provided convenient pathways to distant lands. Coastal and riverine navigation skills were already deeply embedded in the society, making long-distance travel feasible. For communities accustomed to using the sea as a primary route of communication, transport. Extending these skills to foreign lands was both a logical and achievable progression. Psychological and experiential motivations. Beyond practical concerns, psychological and experiential factors played a subtle yet important role. Vikings were explorers at heart, accustomed to testing the limits of their environment and their own capabilities. The lure of distant lands, exotic cultures, unfamiliar cities, and legendary wealth stimulated curiosity and ambition. Encounters with foreign merchants, travelers, and returning raiders brought stories of distant civilizations, fueling dreams of adventure and conquest. The act of navigating unfamiliar seas and confronting unknown adversaries offered not only potential material gain, but also personal fulfillment and excitement, motivating individuals to undertake extraordinary journeys. Strategic motivations, reconnaissance, and opportunity. Finally, strategic considerations influenced Viking decisions to raid beyond Europe. Early contacts with the Islamic world, particularly through trade in silver and minor reconnaissance raids along the Iberian coast, revealed both the riches and vulnerabilities of Mediterranean societies. The Vikings were skilled observers, noting weaknesses in coastal defenses, the timing of tides and currents, and patterns of political fragmentation. Knowledge gained from smaller expeditions informed the planning of larger raids, allowing the Vikings to exploit opportunity with precision. Each voyage built experience, intelligence, and confidence, gradually expanding the scope of their ambitions. Conclusion: the decision to raid beyond Europe was therefore the product of multiple interrelated factors. Economic incentives promised wealth and resources, far exceeding what Scandinavia could provide. Social and cultural pressures rewarded courage, risk-taking, and reputation building. Political dynamics at home created both necessity and opportunity for expansion. Environmental pressures, demographic realities, and the natural geography of Scandinavia encouraged maritime exploration. Psychological curiosity and strategic observation further pushed ambitious individuals toward distant lands. Together, these motivations created a potent mix that made the Mediterranean, a wealthy, fragmented, and navigable region, a highly attractive target for northern raiders. By the 85s, these converging factors had matured sufficiently to produce Viking expeditions of remarkable ambition and reach. What began as localized raiding and trade gradually evolved into long-distance voyages aimed at the heart of the Islamic Mediterranean. The raids of 859 AD were not the result of chance or mere audacity. They were the culmination of decades of preparation, observation, and strategic calculation, driven by deeply rooted motivations that intertwined wealth, honor, opportunity, and survival. The Vikings' expansion beyond Europe illustrates the complexity and adaptability of their society, revealing a culture capable of turning environmental challenges, social pressures, and ambition into feats of extraordinary maritime achievement.